Judge Thomas Bennett sat behind the elevated bench in the dimly lit courtroom, glancing over the documents of his current case. The buzz of whispers echoed through the room, and the faint hum of the overhead lights seemed to grow louder in the moments of silence. He'd seen countless cases like this one: petty theft, young offenders, a revolving door of troubled teens. But when the bailiff called the next name, Thomas's world shifted ever so slightly. "Emily Johnson, please step forward." Thomas looked up, his gaze falling upon a girl no older than 16. Her brown hair hung loose around her shoulders, and there was a defiant spark in her blue eyes. The way she walked, shoulders hunched slightly as if expecting the world to come down on her at any moment, was all too familiar. A knot tightened in Thomas's stomach, and for a moment, he struggled to breathe. As Emily took her place, Thomas studied her features more closely. The resemblance was startling. Her cheekbones, her nose, the small mole on the side of her neck, it all mirrored Rachel, his daughter who had disappeared 10 years ago. The sight stirred something deep inside him, a mix of longing and despair that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. He quickly forced his attention back to the case file. It was important to remain impartial. Emily Johnson was facing charges for shoplifting from a local convenience store, a minor offense, but one that could escalate if she had a history of run-ins with the law. Thomas's voice was steady, though he felt his hands tremble as he spoke. "Emily Johnson," he began, "you are charged with petty theft. How do you plead?" Emily's eyes darted to the side before she muttered, "Guilty." Thomas nodded. It was the expected response. He glanced at the probation officer's report, a history of unstable foster homes, no known biological family. That familiar knot in his stomach tightened as he tried to shake off the growing suspicion. It was just a coincidence, he told himself. The world was full of people who looked like others. But as the hearing continued, he found himself distracted, unable to dismiss the nagging feeling that he was staring into the past. Every now and then, Emily would shift her weight or fidget with her hair, small movements that reminded him so much of Rachel. He couldn't help but wonder, could it really be her? The court session progressed, with Emily's lawyer pleading for leniency, citing her troubled upbringing and lack of a stable home. Thomas listened attentively, but his mind was already racing ahead, revisiting the day Rachel had gone missing. It was a day like any other, sunny, warm, with no hint that his life would soon shatter into a million pieces. He had left her at a friend's house, and when he returned to pick her up, she was gone without a trace. The memory haunted him every day, a wound that never fully healed. Finally, the court proceedings came to an end. Thomas gave Emily a deferred sentence, ordering her to complete community service and attend a rehabilitation program for at-risk youth. As the words left his mouth, he felt a pang of guilt. Was he being too lenient because of his suspicions? Or was he simply trying to help a troubled girl who reminded him of his own daughter? "Court is adjourned," he said, tapping his gavel. As the courtroom began to empty, Thomas lingered, his eyes following Emily as she walked out. His mind buzzed with questions he had no right to ask, but couldn't let go. Who was this girl? Could it really be possible that, after all these years, Rachel had somehow ended up in front of him under a different name? For the first time in a long while, Thomas felt the old spark of hope reignite in his chest, along with an ache of fear. He knew he had to find out more about Emily, but he also knew that stepping over the line could jeopardize his career. He would have to proceed carefully, both as a judge and as a father. As he left the courtroom, Thomas couldn't help but cast one last glance at the door where Emily had disappeared. He could almost hear Rachel's voice echoing in his ears, as if calling out to him from a distant memory. Thomas Bennett found it difficult to focus for the rest of the day. The courtroom's usual rhythm, cases moving in and out like a steady flow of water, now felt like a background hum as his thoughts kept drifting back to Emily Johnson. The resemblance to Rachel was too uncanny to be dismissed as mere coincidence. He had seen thousands of faces in his courtroom over the years, but none had ever triggered the kind of reaction Emily had. That evening, in the quiet of his office, Thomas sat at his desk, his fingers tapping restlessly on a stack of case files. He knew it was inappropriate to involve himself further. Judges were supposed to remain impartial, to make decisions based on facts, not personal feelings. But as a father, he couldn't ignore the possibility, no matter how slim, that Emily could be his daughter. His hands trembled slightly as he pulled up Emily's case file again. There was little to go on. Her background information was sparse, with just a few lines about her history in the foster care system. Emily had been placed in various homes after being found abandoned when she was about 7 years old. No birth certificate or records of her biological parents existed in the system. The more he read, the more his heart raced. Rachel had been 8 when she disappeared, close enough in age that it seemed possible. Thomas's thoughts turned to the adoption records. He wasn't sure how much he could uncover without crossing ethical boundaries, but he felt a burning need to know more. He reached for his phone and hesitated. Contacting social services would be a risk. He could easily be accused of stepping outside his jurisdiction. Yet, at that moment, his desperation as a father outweighed his caution as a judge. He dialed the number of an old colleague who now worked in Child Protective Services, someone he could trust to be discreet. When she answered, Thomas chose his words carefully. "Hi, Marlene. It's Thomas Bennett. I'm hoping you can help me with a favor. It's about a girl named Emily Johnson. She's been in the foster system for a while. I was wondering if you had any additional records on her background or adoption history." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Thomas, you know I can't just give you that information without a proper request," Marlene replied. Her tone was cautious, but there was an underlying sympathy in her voice. She knew about Rachel's disappearance. Many people in the judicial circle did. "I'm not asking for anything official," Thomas said quickly. I think there might be a connection to an old case of mine. Anything you can tell me would help." After a moment, Marlene sighed. "I'll see what I can find. But Thomas, don't get your hopes up." He hung up the phone, his chest tightening with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. As he sat there in the dim light of his office, the weight of the past came crashing down on him. Rachel's disappearance had left an open wound, one that never seemed to heal no matter how much time passed. Now, the possibility that she might have survived and ended up in the foster system under a different name ignited a small flicker of hope that he hadn't felt in years. The next day, Marlene called him back. "I did some digging," she said. Emily was indeed abandoned when she was around 7. There was no trace of her family. She was found wandering in a park, with no memory of how she got there. They couldn't get much information from her, just that she didn't know where her parents were. Her case has always been a bit of a mystery. Thomas's heart sank and lifted at the same time. It was still not enough to confirm his suspicions, but it made the possibility seem a little more real. There was something about Emily's past that echoed Rachel's disappearance, too many similarities to ignore. Later that evening, Thomas sat in his car parked across from Emily's group home. He watched as teenagers came and went, some laughing, others staring at the ground as they shuffled inside. He knew this was a step too far, watching Emily outside of a legal context, but he couldn't stop himself. If she was Rachel, he needed to know. And if she wasn't, then maybe this search, however irrational, was just his mind trying to cope with a grief that never faded. Emily finally emerged, walking with her head down and her hands in her jacket pockets. Thomas's breath caught in his throat as he observed her from a distance, noticing every small gesture, every movement that seemed familiar. In that moment, the line between his duty as a judge and his instincts as a father blurred completely. He was no longer sure if he was seeking justice or closure. Perhaps he was chasing a ghost. But one thing was certain, he had to find out the truth about Emily Johnson, no matter where it led him. As the days passed, Thomas found it increasingly difficult to keep his thoughts from drifting back to Emily. The idea that she might somehow be connected to Rachel seemed absurd, yet it was the only thing that made sense in the chaotic mix of emotions that had begun to resurface. He had spent the last 10 years carefully locking away every memory of his daughter, burying the pain under layers of routine and responsibility. But now, those memories seemed to be seeping through the cracks, uninvited and unrelenting. Late one evening, Thomas sat alone in his living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand. The room was dimly lit, casting shadows across the framed photographs that lined the mantelpiece, reminders of a life that had once been whole. His gaze fell on a picture of Rachel, taken just a few months before she had disappeared. She was smiling, her blue eyes bright and full of life. He closed his eyes, and in his mind, the memories played out like an old film reel, fuzzy around the edges but vivid enough to make his heart ache. He remembered the last time he had seen her. It had been a warm summer day, the sun hanging high in the sky. He had dropped her off at a friend's house for a sleepover. They had hugged goodbye, and she had kissed him on the cheek before skipping up the walkway, her ponytail bouncing behind her. He had never thought, even for a moment, that it would be the last time he would see her. The initial search had been frantic. The police had combed through every inch of the area, interviewed everyone who could have seen anything. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, hope had faded into despair. Thomas had thrown himself into his work, using it as a shield against the crushing weight of his loss. Even as the years passed, there was always a small part of him that clung to the hope that she might somehow come back. Now, that hope was resurfacing with a vengeance, pulling him into a dangerous place. The doorbell rang, jolting him from his thoughts. He set down the glass and opened the door to find Marlene standing there, holding a manila folder. "I thought you might want to see this," she said softly, handing him the folder. "It's the adoption records I could find on Emily. It's not much, but maybe it will help." Thomas took the folder, his hands trembling slightly. "Thank you, Marlene," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. After she left, he opened the folder with a mix of dread and anticipation. Inside were the scant details of Emily's life before adoption. The records confirmed what Marlene had told him earlier. Emily had been found wandering alone in a park, with no memory of her past. She had given no clues about where she came from or who her parents were. The authorities had searched for her family, but when no one came forward to claim her, she was placed into the foster care system. The information was sparse, but one detail caught Thomas's eye, a brief note written by a social worker who had first spoken with Emily. It mentioned that the girl had refused to speak for weeks after being found, and when she finally did, she spoke of forgetting things. The social worker had chalked it up to trauma, but Thomas couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it than that. For the next few days, the memories of Rachel's disappearance intertwined with the new information about Emily, creating a storm of thoughts that Thomas couldn't seem to calm. He began to revisit the investigation of Rachel's case in his spare time, combing through old police reports and witness statements, searching for any small detail he might have missed. There had been sightings, of course, people claiming to have seen a girl who looked like Rachel in various places across the country, but none of them had ever led anywhere. One night, as he was poring over the old files, Thomas came across a photograph he hadn't seen in years. It was taken by a security camera at a gas station about 50 miles from where Rachel had disappeared. The grainy image showed a young girl in the background, her face partially obscured, but there was something about her posture that reminded Thomas of Rachel. The police had dismissed it at the time due to the lack of clear evidence, but now, looking at it with fresh eyes, he wondered if it could have been her. He picked up the phone and called Marlene again. "I need you to help me dig a little deeper," he said. "There's an old lead I want to revisit." "Thomas, you know you're pushing your limits here," she cautioned. "You're not an investigator anymore." "I know," he replied, his voice steady but filled with a quiet desperation. "But I have to know if I'm chasing a ghost or if there's a chance Emily could really be Rachel." As he hung up, a wave of guilt washed over him. He wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing. It felt as though he was reopening old wounds, but at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was out there, just within reach. And if there was even the slightest possibility that Emily was his daughter, he owed it to both her and Rachel to find out. Thomas sat in his office the next morning, the adoption records and old case files spread out on his desk. He was deeply engrossed in his investigation, every small detail fueling his growing belief that Emily could be Rachel. His focus was broken by the sound of his assistant's voice over the intercom, reminding him of his first hearing for the day. He quickly gathered the papers and tucked them back into the folder, though his mind remained preoccupied. As the day wore on, Thomas found himself distracted during court sessions. His thoughts constantly drifted back to Emily, to the mystery of her past and the possibility of finding his daughter after all these years. The weight of uncertainty bore down on him. He had to do more, to push further, even if it meant breaking the unspoken rules of his profession. Later that afternoon, Thomas drove to the address listed as Emily's group home, a modest brick building tucked away in a quiet part of town. He hesitated before stepping out of the car, unsure of what he was going to say or do. It wasn't like him to approach a situation without a plan, but this time, it was different. His heart led the way, and his mind struggled to catch up. He knocked on the door and was greeted by one of the staff members, a middle-aged woman with a kind but wary expression. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but guarded. "Yes, I'm Judge Bennett," he said, flashing a courteous smile. "I've presided over a case involving one of your residents, Emily Johnson. I was hoping I could speak with her guardian or the person responsible for her case management." The woman nodded, leading him inside and down a narrow hallway. "I'll get Mrs. Harper for you. She's the head of the home and has been overseeing Emily's case." A few moments later, Thomas was seated across from Mrs. Harper, a stout woman with graying hair who exuded both warmth and authority. As he explained the nature of his visit, her expression shifted from curiosity to concern. "Judge Bennett, I'm not sure I understand why you would need to speak with Emily outside of a legal context," she said, folding her hands neatly on the desk. Thomas hesitated before answering. "I know this may seem unorthodox, but there are aspects of Emily's history that I'd like to understand better. I have reasons to believe that her past may be connected to an old case involving a missing person. I'm not asking for anything confidential, just a chance to speak with her about her life before she was adopted." Mrs. Harper's brow furrowed. "Emily's case is very sensitive. She doesn't remember much about her life before coming into the system, and what little she does recall is often fragmented and inconsistent. We've worked hard to help her cope with the trauma she's experienced." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more sincere tone. "Please, Mrs. Harper. I wouldn't be asking if this wasn't important. I'm just looking for a chance, no, a hope, that I can connect the dots. If it turns out to be nothing, I'll accept that and move on. But if there's even the slightest possibility that she is someone I lost a long time ago." There was a long silence. Finally, Mrs. Harper sighed. "I'll allow you to speak with Emily, but you need to tread carefully. She doesn't take well to authority figures asking too many questions." Thomas nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you. I'll do my best." Emily was brought into the room a few minutes later. She looked apprehensive, her eyes darting between Thomas and Mrs. Harper as if trying to gauge whether she was in trouble. Thomas gave her a reassuring smile, though it did little to ease the tension in the air. "Hi, Emily," he began. "I wanted to talk to you about something important. I know this might seem strange, but I've been trying to learn more about your life before you were adopted. It might be connected to a case that's very personal to me." Emily's posture stiffened, and her eyes narrowed slightly. "What does my past have to do with you?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I had a daughter, Rachel. She disappeared when she was about your age. There are things about your story that remind me of what happened to her. I know it sounds far-fetched, but I've seen enough similarities to make me wonder if maybe you could be Rachel." The room fell silent as Emily stared at him, her face a mix of confusion and disbelief. "Rachel," she repeated, as though trying to grasp the meaning behind the name. "You think I'm your daughter?" Thomas's voice softened. "I don't know, Emily. But I'm hoping you can help me find out." Emily pushed back in her chair, crossing her arms defensively. "So, what? You think just because I don't know where I came from, I must be your lost daughter?" Her tone was sharp, a mix of hurt and skepticism. "No, that's not it," Thomas replied calmly. "I'm not trying to force anything on you. I just want to understand if there's any possibility. If it turns out I'm wrong, then we'll both know." But if there's even a chance. Emily shook her head, her expression hardened. I don't remember anything from before I was found. And even if I did, I don't think it matters now. The rejection stung, but Thomas didn't blame her. He knew this was a lot to ask of a girl who had spent much of her life without a stable home or clear identity. But as she got up to leave, he noticed something, a small tremor in her voice, a fleeting look in her eyes that suggested there was more beneath the surface. Emily, he called after her. She paused at the door but didn't turn around. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. You don't have to go through this alone. She left without saying another word. As Thomas sat there in the silence that followed, he felt a mix of regret and determination. He wasn't sure if he had taken the right approach, but he knew one thing for certain: he was not ready to give up. The days following his encounter with Emily left Thomas with a lingering feeling of uncertainty. He kept replaying their conversation in his mind, analyzing every word, every expression on her face, trying to decipher if there had been any sign of recognition, any spark of familiarity. Yet, the more he thought about it, the more elusive the answers seemed. Despite Emily's resistance, Thomas wasn't willing to let the matter rest. He knew he had to approach her differently if he wanted to make progress. So, he decided to back off, at least for a while, hoping to build trust rather than pressuring her for answers she might not even have. A week later, the opportunity arose when Thomas was approached by a community outreach program seeking volunteers for a local youth initiative. It wasn't uncommon for the court to recommend that young offenders participate in such programs, and Thomas realized it might be the perfect way to interact with Emily in a more natural setting. He arranged to oversee one of the activities at the community center, where Emily was assigned as part of her deferred sentence. When he arrived at the center, he saw Emily at the far end of the gym, sweeping the floor half-heartedly. She glanced up and noticed him, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Her expression was guarded, but there was a hint of curiosity there too. Thomas walked over, his steps unhurried. "Hey, Emily," he greeted, keeping his tone casual. "Didn't expect to see you here today." She shrugged. "Community service hours, remember? Guess I don't have much of a choice." He nodded. "Well, you're in luck. Today we're setting up for a fundraiser, and I could use some help arranging the tables." Emily gave a half-smile, the kind that barely lifted the corners of her mouth. "Sure, whatever," she replied, her tone carrying the familiar edge of defiance. As they worked together, setting up chairs and decorations, Thomas made a conscious effort to keep the conversation light. They talked about the weather, the music playing over the gym speakers, and even a little bit about Emily's favorite subjects in school. Slowly, she began to loosen up. He could see that beneath her guarded exterior was a bright, perceptive young girl who had learned to put up walls for self-protection. At one point, Emily paused and looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "You know, you don't have to keep trying to talk to me," she said. "If this is about what you said last time, I'm not going to suddenly remember something just because you're being nice." Thomas met her gaze, choosing his words carefully. "I'm not expecting you to," he said gently. "And I'm not trying to force anything. I thought maybe we could talk as people, not as a judge and a defendant." Emily hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Okay," she murmured, turning back to the table she was arranging. "But it's still weird." He chuckled softly. "I suppose it is." As the day wore on, they fell into a rhythm. The more they worked side by side, the easier the conversation flowed. Emily even shared a little bit about her experiences in the foster system, moving from one home to another, never staying in one place long enough to form real connections. The way she spoke of it was matter-of-fact, with a touch of bitterness, as though she had long ago accepted that life was unpredictable and full of disappointments. Thomas listened, a deep ache forming in his chest. He wanted to say something comforting, something to bridge the gap between them, but he knew that words alone wouldn't be enough. It was in these moments that he saw glimpses of Rachel, not just in Emily's appearance, but in the way she hesitated to trust, the way she sometimes stared off as if lost in thought. It was like looking at the reflection of a memory, something familiar yet just out of reach. At the end of the day, as they were packing up, Thomas handed Emily a bottle of water and said, "I know this probably doesn't mean much coming from me, but you did a good job today." She took the bottle, looking slightly surprised. "Thanks," she said, almost as if she wasn't sure how to respond to a compliment. He gave her a small, encouraging smile. "You know, if you ever feel like talking about anything, I'm here." Emily glanced away, her fingers twisting the cap off the bottle. "I don't really know what there is to talk about," she said quietly. "My life is just the way it is." "Sometimes it helps to talk about it anyway," Thomas replied. "Even if it doesn't change anything." For a moment, Emily seemed to consider this, but then she shrugged and took a sip of water. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice noncommittal. Thomas nodded, knowing that was the closest thing to a breakthrough he was going to get for now. As he watched Emily walk away, he felt a mix of hope and frustration. She was opening up, but slowly, cautiously, as if testing the waters before diving in. It would take time, and he had to be patient. But at least, for the first time, there was a glimmer of connection, one that, he hoped, could eventually lead to the answers he had been searching for. A few weeks passed, and Thomas found himself growing increasingly anxious about finding out the truth. His cautious attempts to build a connection with Emily had made some progress, but he knew that if he wanted to confirm his suspicions, he needed more than just a feeling. The idea of a DNA test had lingered in the back of his mind since the beginning, but he hadn't known how to approach it without overstepping boundaries. He couldn't shake the need for a definitive answer. Finally, he decided to take a chance, even if it meant risking everything. He reached out to an old contact, a private investigator who had helped him during the initial search for Rachel all those years ago. If there was anyone who could discreetly assist him, it would be this person. The investigator, Jack, was a gruff, no-nonsense man in his late 50s who had seen his fair share of cold cases and missing persons. He had been one of the few people who hadn't given up on finding Rachel, even when the leads dried up. When Thomas called him, he was more than willing to help. "This is highly unorthodox, you know," Jack said when they met at a quiet coffee shop on the outskirts of town. "But if you're sure this girl might be Rachel, then I can get a DNA sample without raising any red flags." "I'm sure," Thomas replied, though the words came out more uncertain than he intended. "I need to know, Jack. I need to put this to rest." A few days later, Jack called Thomas with an update. "I got a sample from the water bottle she was using at the community center," he said. "I'll send it to the lab. We should have results within a week or two." Thomas thanked him and hung up, a wave of conflicting emotions surging through him. The days that followed were some of the longest he could remember. He threw himself into his work, but even in the courtroom, his mind wandered. Every time he saw Emily at the community center, he wondered if he was looking at his daughter or just another lost soul who happened to resemble her. He didn't know which outcome would be more difficult to accept. Finally, Jack called him back. "The results are in," he said. "But there's a problem." Thomas's pulse quickened. "What kind of problem?" "The sample was inconclusive," Jack explained. "It's not a definitive match, but it's not a complete mismatch either. The DNA was too degraded to give us a clear answer. If you want to pursue this further, you'll need a more direct sample." The news hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. The result he had waited for, hoped for, was now another question mark, another layer of uncertainty added to the already complicated situation. "So, what does that mean?" he asked, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "Am I chasing a ghost here, or is there still a chance?" "There's still a chance," Jack replied. "But it's a slim one. You'd need Emily's consent to get a more reliable sample, and even then, it might not be conclusive if her DNA was somehow affected by her time in the foster system. Trauma, malnutrition, those kinds of things can complicate results." Thomas hung up the phone, his thoughts swirling. How could he approach Emily with this? How could he ask her for something so personal without shattering the fragile connection they had been building? He was starting to feel like he was running out of time. If she wasn't Rachel, then he was on the verge of making a terrible mistake, one that could hurt both of them deeply. That evening, Thomas drove to the community center, where Emily was once again doing her community service. As he walked in, he saw her cleaning up after one of the activities, looking as if she was lost in thought. It wasn't until he approached her that she noticed his presence. "Hey," she said, setting down a stack of papers. "You're here again." Thomas nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Emily, there's something I need to talk to you about," he began, his voice low. "And it's not easy for me to say." Her expression hardened slightly, a wary look in her eyes. "What is it?" He hesitated, then spoke. I've been trying to find out if you're connected to someone I lost a long time ago. I know I mentioned my daughter before, Rachel. I took a DNA sample from a water bottle, just to see if there was a possibility that you might be her." Emily's eyes widened, and she took a step back. "You did what?" she said, her voice rising in anger. "You took my DNA without asking me?" "I know it was wrong," Thomas said quickly. "I know I crossed a line. But the results were inconclusive. I need a direct sample, and I'm asking if you'd be willing to provide one." Emily shook her head, her face flushed with emotion. "This is insane," she said. "You can't just decide that I'm your daughter because you want me to be. You don't know anything about me." "I know that you deserve to know the truth, whatever it may be," Thomas replied, his voice steady but pleading. "And I'm willing to accept the outcome, whatever it is. But if there's even a small chance that you could be Rachel, I need to know." "We both do." Emily was silent for a long moment, her expression a mixture of anger and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "I'll think about it," she said at last, her voice cold. Then she turned and walked away, leaving Thomas standing there, his heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The days dragged on in a tense silence. Emily had neither agreed nor refused to take the DNA test, and Thomas felt as though he was standing on the edge of a precipice, waiting for a sign of which way to fall. He couldn't push her any further, not without risking the fragile progress they had made. But the more time passed, the more his doubts began to creep in, gnawing at him with each passing day. One evening, as Thomas was leaving the courthouse, his phone rang. It was Jack, the private investigator. "Thomas, we need to talk," Jack said, his voice sounding graver than usual. "I found something else, something you might not want to hear." "Go on," Thomas replied, his grip tightening on the phone. "Remember that lead we revisited? The one from the gas station security camera all those years ago?" Jack asked. "I did some more digging, talked to a few people who might have seen Rachel around that time. Turns out, there was a person of interest who was never fully investigated, someone who was close to your family." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean, someone close to my family?" Jack hesitated before speaking. "Your brother, Robert. He was questioned briefly after Rachel disappeared, but the police didn't follow up because they didn't have any concrete evidence. I spoke with a few old acquaintances, and there were rumors, people suggesting that Robert was acting strangely around the time Rachel went missing." The words hit Thomas like a sledgehammer. Robert? His own brother? It seemed impossible, unthinkable. Robert had always been a bit of a drifter, never settling down or staying in one place for too long, but Thomas had never suspected him of anything more than a lack of direction in life. "That's ridiculous," Thomas said, shaking his head. "Robert wouldn't, he couldn't." "I know it's hard to hear," Jack continued, his voice steady. "But I have a contact who might know more, someone who was close to Robert back then. I think it's worth checking out, Thomas. We can't leave any stone unturned." Thomas ended the call, his mind reeling. He drove home in a daze, barely aware of the roads and traffic around him. When he arrived, he didn't go inside right away. Instead, he sat in his car, staring at the dimly lit windows of his house, as memories of Robert flashed through his mind, memories that suddenly took on a different meaning. Growing up, Robert had always been the troublemaker of the family. He was charming and quick-witted, but there had always been an edge to him, a restlessness that made it hard for anyone to get too close. When Rachel had disappeared, Robert had been living a few towns over. He had come to support the family during the initial search, but soon after, he had drifted away, as he always did. Thomas hadn't thought much of it at the time. Grief affected people in different ways. But now, with Jack's revelations, doubts he had never allowed himself to entertain began to take root. The next morning, Thomas arranged to meet with Jack's contact. The man was a former bartender who had worked at a place Robert used to frequent. They met at a small diner, the kind of place where old secrets seemed to hang in the air. The bartender, a grizzled man with gray hair and a deep voice, looked Thomas in the eye. "I remember Robert," he said. "He used to come in a lot back then. I can't say I knew him well, but there was this one night, about a month after your daughter went missing. He was drunk, kept mumbling about regretting something he couldn't take back. It didn't make much sense at the time, but it stuck with me." Thomas's chest tightened. Did he ever mention Rachel? Or say anything that would suggest he knew something about what happened to her? The bartender shook his head. Not directly. But there was something in the way he talked, like he was carrying a burden. "I never pried, it wasn't my place. But looking back, I always wondered if he knew more than he let on." Thomas left the diner feeling as though the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. The implications were devastating, and the idea that his own brother could have been involved in Rachel's disappearance was almost too painful to consider. But as much as he wanted to dismiss the possibility, he knew he couldn't ignore it. He drove to Robert's last known address, a small apartment on the outskirts of town. When he arrived, he hesitated before knocking on the door. A moment later, the door opened, revealing a disheveled-looking Robert, who seemed genuinely surprised to see his brother standing there. "Thomas," Robert said, blinking as if he hadn't fully processed who was in front of him. "What are you doing here?" Thomas didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need to talk to you about Rachel," he said, his voice cold and direct. "I know you were questioned after she disappeared, but I found out there were rumors, people saying you were acting strangely. I need to know if there's something you're not telling me." Robert's expression shifted from surprise to a defensive scowl. "What are you talking about?" he snapped. "I was as torn up about Rachel as you were. If you're implying that I had something to do with it." "I'm not implying anything," Thomas interrupted, his anger rising. "But if you know something, and you've kept it from us all these years, I need to hear it now." For a moment, Robert seemed to deflate, as if the weight of years was pressing down on him. He ran a hand through his hair and looked away. "Fine," he said, his voice low. "There's something I didn't tell the police. I saw Rachel a few days before she went missing. She was with a girl, someone I didn't recognize. They seemed uneasy, like they were up to something. I didn't think much of it at the time, and then, she was gone." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I didn't know if it meant anything." Robert shot back. "I was scared, okay? I didn't want anyone to think I was involved. I thought it was better if I just kept my mouth shut." The revelation left Thomas feeling raw and exposed. There was no clear answer here, only more questions. And as he left his brother's apartment, he realized that whatever the truth was, it was closer than ever, yet still just out of reach. The revelation about Robert left Thomas with a heavy sense of dread. He had come looking for answers, but instead, he had found another tangled thread in the web of Rachel's disappearance. Now, he had to decide what to do with it. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered, but they felt as though they were starting to fit together, just not in the way he had hoped. The next day, Thomas called Jack to update him on the conversation with Robert. He admitted to seeing Rachel with another girl just days before she disappeared, Thomas said. He never mentioned it to anyone before. "I need to know who that girl was, if she even existed." Jack sighed on the other end of the line. "I'll dig into it, see if I can find any old witness statements or reports from the time that might have mentioned a friend Rachel was seen with," he said. "But, Thomas, we're working with scraps here. It's a long shot." "I understand," Thomas replied. "But I need to follow this, wherever it leads." As the days passed, Thomas felt the weight of his own helplessness growing. He had always believed in the power of the law to bring about justice, but now he was finding that sometimes the truth lay beyond its reach. He couldn't help but feel that he had failed both Rachel and Emily by not being able to untangle the threads of their stories sooner. Determined to make progress, Thomas decided to speak to Emily once more. The thought of confronting her again made him uneasy, but he knew he needed to share what he had learned and see if it triggered any memories for her. He arrived at the community center where she had been continuing her service. She was in the back, cleaning up the gym after a youth program. When Emily saw him, her expression was guarded but less hostile than during their last conversation. "You're back," she said, setting down a box of supplies. "I figured you might have given up by now." Thomas gave her a faint smile. "I don't give up that easily," he replied. "But I'm not here to ask you about the DNA test again. I need to tell you something." Emily crossed her arms, listening. "What is it?" "After our last conversation, I found out that my brother, Robert, saw Rachel with another girl just days before she went missing," Thomas explained. "He never told anyone, not the police, not our family. I'm trying to find out who that girl was. I know this might not mean much to you, but does any of this sound familiar?" Emily's brow furrowed, and she shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "I don't remember anything like that." Thomas's heart sank, though he had been prepared for this response. "I understand," he said softly. "I just thought it was worth a try." She glanced away, then back at him, as if hesitating before speaking. "You know, I've been having these dreams," she admitted, her voice quiet. "They're not exactly memories, but there's a girl in them. I can never see her face clearly, but I always feel like we're running from something." Thomas's pulse quickened. "When did these dreams start?" "A few weeks ago," Emily said, her voice unsure. "It's probably just a coincidence, though. Dreams don't mean anything." "Maybe," Thomas replied, though a small flicker of hope sparked in his chest. "But sometimes, the mind remembers things we think we've forgotten. If you do remember anything at all, please tell me." Emily didn't respond right away. She picked up the box of supplies again, her expression unreadable. "I'll think about it," she finally said, then turned to walk away. As Thomas left the community center, his thoughts swirled around Emily's words. Her dreams might not have been significant on their own, but they fit with everything else: a girl seen with Rachel, the sense of running from something, the hazy edges of a past Emily couldn't quite grasp. It was as if the truth was right there, just beyond his reach. That evening, Jack called with an update. "I found something interesting," he said. There was a report about a girl Rachel used to spend time with, a friend named Jessica, who moved away shortly after Rachel disappeared. Her family never cooperated much with the investigation, and they left town without leaving a forwarding address. "It's a slim lead, but it's something." Thomas's mind raced. "Do you think this Jessica could be the girl Robert saw with Rachel?" "It's possible," Jack replied. "I'll see if I can track her down or find any information about her family." As Thomas hung up, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't sure if this would lead to the answers he sought, but it was a path forward. For the first time in what felt like weeks, he allowed himself to believe that he might be closing in on the truth. As the days went by, Thomas waited for Jack to find more information about Jessica. The possibility that this girl could hold the key to unlocking the mystery of Rachel's disappearance consumed him. He had spent years searching for answers, and now, the pieces seemed to be coming together. But amidst the urgency to find Rachel, there was also the reality of Emily, someone who had her own life and wasn't simply a substitute for the daughter he had lost. One afternoon, as Thomas was preparing to leave the courthouse, his phone buzzed. It was Jack. "I tracked down Jessica," he said. "She's living in another state now, married with kids. She agreed to talk, but there's something you need to know. She remembers Rachel, and she mentioned that they were indeed planning to run away together around the time of the disappearance." Thomas felt a surge of conflicting emotions, relief at having a potential breakthrough, and dread over what this could mean. "Why would they want to run away?" he asked. "Jessica didn't go into details," Jack replied. She said there were things happening in Rachel's life that she didn't feel safe talking about at the time. It's clear she's still uneasy about it. I can arrange for you to speak with her if you want. Thomas agreed, and the next day, he sat across from Jessica in a small cafe, his pulse racing as she recounted what she remembered. Rachel was scared, Jessica began, her voice trembling slightly. There were things happening at home that she wouldn't talk about, things she thought people wouldn't believe. She just wanted to get away. Thomas listened intently, his mind spinning with the possibilities. Do you know who or what she was running from? He asked. Jessica shook her head. She never said directly. But there was someone, a man. I'm not sure who he was, but Rachel said she felt like he was always watching her. I was going to go with her, but I got scared. The night we were supposed to leave, I didn't show up, and then she was gone. The revelation sent a chill down Thomas's spine. It was a piece of the puzzle he hadn't anticipated, someone else involved, someone who had possibly influenced Rachel's decision to disappear. But who could it have been? The possibilities were too many, and none of them provided a clear path forward. After the meeting with Jessica, Thomas drove to the community center, where Emily was wrapping up her community service for the day. She saw him as he approached, a wary expression on her face. Did you find what you were looking for? She asked, a note of sarcasm in her voice. Thomas shook his head. Not everything, he admitted. But I did find out that Rachel was planning to run away. She was scared, and there was someone she felt threatened by. I don't know who it was, but it's another piece of the story. Emily's eyes softened, and she looked down at the floor. I've thought about what you said, she began, her voice hesitant. About the DNA test. I'll do it. If it'll give you the answers you need. Thomas felt a wave of relief mixed with apprehension. Are you sure? He asked. This isn't just about me. It's about you too. I know, Emily replied, meeting his gaze. And that's why I need to know. I need to know if there's a reason for these dreams, these feelings I've been having. I need to know who I really am. They agreed to set up the test for the following week. As the day of the test approached, Thomas couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened since Emily first entered his courtroom. He had started this journey hoping to find Rachel, but along the way, he had discovered someone else, someone who had her own struggles, her own identity, and who deserved to know the truth just as much as he did. The night before the test, Thomas sat in his living room, staring at the picture of Rachel on the mantel. He had tried to prepare himself for every possible outcome, but deep down, he knew there would be no real way to shield himself from the impact of the results. If Emily wasn't Rachel, then the search for his daughter would continue, as painful and uncertain as ever. But if she was, it would be the end of one journey and the beginning of another, one that would require both of them to confront the past and redefine what it meant to be a family. The day of the DNA test arrived, and Thomas and Emily met at the clinic. The atmosphere was tense, the weight of unspoken fears and hopes hanging in the air between them. They sat side by side in the waiting room, both silent, their thoughts spinning in different directions. For Emily, the test would either confirm a connection to a past she couldn't remember or shatter the faint hope that she might belong to someone, somewhere. For Thomas, it was the culmination of years of searching for closure and answers. The test itself took only a few moments. A simple swab of the cheek, a few signatures on forms, and then it was over. But the wait for the results felt like an eternity. As they walked out of the clinic, Thomas turned to Emily. Do you want me to be there when the results come in? He asked, his voice calm but laden with emotion. Emily glanced at him, her expression guarded but with a hint of vulnerability in her eyes. Yeah, she said quietly. I think I'd like that. The following week seemed to stretch on forever. Thomas tried to stay occupied with work, while Emily continued her community service, but the upcoming revelation was always there, lurking in the back of their minds. When the call from the clinic finally came, Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. He listened as the nurse told him that the results were ready, and he could come in to discuss them. He called Emily immediately. The results are in, he said. We can pick them up today. Emily's voice was steady, but there was a slight tremor. "Okay. I'll meet you there." They arrived at the clinic together, and the nurse escorted them into a private room where a doctor was waiting with a folder on the desk in front of him. He opened the folder and glanced at the papers inside before looking up at them. "I know this is an important moment for both of you," the doctor began. "So I'll get right to the point. The results show that there is no biological match. Emily is not Rachel." The words seemed to echo in the small room. Thomas felt a mixture of emotions swell up inside him: disappointment, relief, sadness, and even a sense of guilt for feeling relieved at all. He glanced at Emily, who was staring at the floor, her expression blank. "I'm sorry," the doctor said softly. "I know this isn't the outcome you were hoping for." As they left the clinic, the weight of finality pressed down on them. For Thomas, it was the end of a decade-long search, the closing of a door that he had kept ajar for far too long. For Emily, it was the realization that the answers she sought were still out of reach, that she still didn't know who she really was or where she came from. Outside the clinic, Emily took a deep breath and turned to Thomas. "So, that's it then?" she asked, her voice wavering. "I'm just, no one?" Thomas shook his head, his gaze steady as he looked at her. "No," he said firmly. "You're not no one. You're Emily. You're strong, you're brave, and you're real. DNA doesn't change that." She blinked, as if taken aback by his words. "But I thought if I was Rachel, then maybe I'd have a family, a place where I belonged." Thomas reached out and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "You may not be Rachel," he said softly. "But that doesn't mean you don't belong. You do. I can't replace the family you never knew, and you can't replace Rachel, but, if you want, we can figure out this next chapter together. You don't have to go through it alone." Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching as for sincerity. "Are you saying, you'd still want me around? Even if I'm not your daughter?" He nodded, a small smile forming on his lips. "I'm saying I care about you, Emily. I've come to know you, not as a replacement for Rachel, but as someone who matters. If you're willing, I'd like to help you find your place in the world. We can start from here." A long silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with unspoken understanding, a kind of peace that neither of them had felt in a long time. Finally, Emily gave a slow nod, as if accepting something she hadn't realized she was looking for. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'd like that." In the weeks that followed, Thomas and Emily found a new kind of routine. They started meeting regularly, sometimes just for coffee, other times to help with her transition out of the group home. He supported her in finding a more permanent living situation and helped her enroll in a program that could assist with her future education. They didn't talk much about the DNA test or Rachel anymore. Instead, they focused on the present, on building a relationship that wasn't defined by the past. Thomas knew that the search for Rachel would never truly end, but for now, he had found something else, a new purpose, a new connection that helped heal the scars he had carried for so long. One day, as they were walking through a park, Thomas pointed to an old oak tree. "You know," he said, "Rachel and I used to come here all the time. She loved climbing that tree." Emily looked at the tree, then back at Thomas. "We could plant a new one," she suggested. "In memory of her." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat, but he nodded. "I'd like that," he said softly. "A new beginning." And so, together, they planted a young sapling beside the old oak, a symbol of growth, resilience, and the enduring bond they had formed. It wasn't the ending Thomas had once imagined, but it was the beginning of something real, and that was more than enough.